بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم صلى الله وسلم عليك يا سيدي ومولاي يا رسول الله صلى الله وسلم عليك يا سيدي ومولاي وابن مولاي يا أبا عبد الله فاز من اعتصم بحبلكم وأمن من لجأ إليكم يا ليتنا كنا معكم فنفوز فوزا عظيما. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا والشفيع لذنوبنا وتبيب نفوسنا أبا القاسم محمد، والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وأمل صالح إن شاء الله، بذكر الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سنة الله في الذين خلوا من قبل ولن تجد لسنة الله تبديلا. آمنا به. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The ayah of the Holy Quran is indeed a very, very interesting ayah, upon which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Allah's precedence, that Allah's decision, His will, and everything that He decides with those who have passed away before, and the nations that have come before us, if you examine their history, if you examine the way they used to live amongst themselves, you will never find a change in Allah's precedence. You will never find a change in the sunnah, in the practice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what this means is that when you observe the verses of the Holy Quran, you will come across an understanding that there are many stories mentioned within the Quran. You have the story of Adam alayhi salam, you have the story of Nuh, you have the story of Musa, you have the story of some of the battles that took place in the time of Rasulullah, you have the story of, for example, Talut, the story of Sulaiman and Dawood, and of course Nabi Yusuf and Yunus and Yaqub, and all of these profound personalities. And so when the question is raised, and it's a fundamental question, why do these stories exist within the Quran? The reason why they exist within the Quran is because greatest lessons or greatest points can be manifested by the narration of stories. In the sense that when I read the story of, for example, Nabi Yusuf and Zulaykha, it's not there to entertain me. When I read the stories of the interactions between Ibrahim alayhi salam and his son Ismail and Ishaq, it's not there so that I entertain myself. Rather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala between the lines begins to present profound points, profound aspects of akhlaq, profound points on aqaid, profound information depicting the obedience, depicting the submission of the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when I read these stories, my responsibility is to be able to digest the information that is there, and it's easy because it's in a form of a story. Not only am I able to digest it, but also try and integrate, extract the lessons that are found within these stories and integrate them within my life. such that when I wake up every morning, I then remind myself some of the stories of the Quran and try and live my life according to how the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used to live. And that is, of course, being in submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, constantly at every moment within our lives. So you find that when you examine these stories in the Holy Quran, and if you were to examine them deeper, you would realize that there is a pattern that exists between all of the different narratives of the prophets, a trend that repeats itself. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it a point to show that every generation amongst every prophet that has come on the face of this earth have gone through the same problem. They have faced, for example, the same response from the people, the same level of dhulm or the same manifestation of dhulm. You find that the concepts, the elements, the knowledge that the prophets used to deliver to their people was all the same. From amongst them, Noah, Ibrahim, Lut, Musa, Isa alayhim salam. You find that all of them came to their people providing information about Tawheed, calling the people towards the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to, of course, stay away from that which Allah has made forbidden. To believe in Nabuwwah, to believe in Al-Ma'ad, the return. All of these are the crux understandings and messages given by the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But at the same time, what's interesting is the response of the people that came back towards these prophets. So you find that many of them, for example, used to belie, they used to deny the prophets, even though they used to perform miracles. Even though these prophets used to come physically in front of their people and perform miracles in front of their eyes, many of them rejected their message. And it was all for the same excuses. And we will see some of these excuses in the course of a few moments. So you find that the style of the prophets, their messages, the reaction of the people, and most importantly, how the majority would reject the message of the prophets, but then you would always find a minority that would always accept the message of the holy prophets of Islam or of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what here is shown to us is that history always tends to repeat itself. It's as if there is a practice, it's as if there is a sunnah that in every generation, in every era, whether it's 5,000 years ago, whether it's 10,000 years ago, or whether it's us living, for example, in the UK in the 21st century, history always tends to repeat itself. Yes, history repeats itself in the sense that the essence, the core, always repeats itself. The principle always repeats itself. The only thing that is different is the language of the people. Our language has changed from 20,000 years ago, for example. The clothes that we wear, the worldview that we have, the education that we have, all of these things, variable things, very relative things, they change. But you find that the core, the essence, the principle of rejecting the belief in the religion of Islam, or the core, the essence, the principles of certain elements always tend to repeat itself from one generation to another. And so therefore in this discussion, what I want to talk about is look at history from a Quranic perspective. And then after that, moving on to the second area of the discussion, we will see how there are different concepts or different elements, what these elements are and how they change over, how they repeat over time. So with regards to the evidences of history or the overlook of history within the Quran, you find that there are many verses. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, begins to narrate many of these verses in the Holy Quran, many of the stories of the Holy Quran, many a times He tends to repeat this one sentence. So for example, in Surah Al-Muhammad, Surah number 47 of the Holy Quran, He says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. أَفَلَمْ يَسِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَيَنْظُرُوا كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ. He says, and go into the lands, travel into the lands and see the consequences of those who came before you. Have you not seen the nature of the consequences of those who came before you? Allah wiped them out. Allah destroyed them. And the same fate will be given to the disbelievers. Again, in Surah Al-Yusuf, in Surah number 12, أَفَلَمْ يَسِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَيَنْظُرُوا كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ. The same exact verse is seen and travel the lands, travel on the lands, and observe the consequences of those who came before them. Meaning what? Meaning that when we study history, when we study history, there is a vital lesson that can be learned. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا فَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا. Or for example, in a different verse, وَلَا تَجِدُ لِسُنَّتِنَا تَحْوِيلًا. You find that because history tends to repeat itself, a person has the ability, a historian, according to the teachings of the Quran, a historian who has taqwa, who has religiosity, who submits to the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, can most definitely predict the future based on what has happened in the past. You find, for example, within the fields of economics, macroeconomics, or even mostly macroeconomics, people or economists tend to predict the future by observing the past. Economists, for example, tend to help the economy in the future by examining, for example, the mistakes that were made in the past. And this is a vital lesson for each and every one of us, that the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala draws our attention in speaking about the history and historical events in the Holy Quran is so that we examine them. There are verses in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks of profound personalities. And then at the same time, Allah begins to speak about their qualities. Allah speaks about their attributes. Allah speaks about their characteristics. And that is so that when I observe why this person was seen as successful, I look at the characteristics that made him successful and I apply it in my life. You look at the example of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Ibrahim, they say that he used to, not just Ibrahim, of course, all of the prophets. You look at, for example, Ibrahim to begin with, he was one who used to observe salah in his life. Ismail كان يأمر أهله بالصلاة. He used to invite his family members to salah. You find, for example, the likes of Musa. He used to observe salah. You look at the examples of Isa in Surah Al-Maryam. He was one who used to observe salah. You find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He speaks about all of these different prophets, He makes it a point, He highlights the fact that these prophets used to constantly recite salah. Therefore, I as an individual, follower of the Holy Quran, if I want to understand what makes me successful in dunya, I realize that one of the things that really brings about success in my life is when I observe salah in my life. Likewise, amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. Likewise, being truthful. Likewise, for example, having good akhlaq. All of these are different traits that was seen by the prophets of Allah, that were held by the prophets of Allah before us. And that is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses them and of course raises their status within the Holy Quran. At the same time, you find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about people who are condemned and rebuked. The likes of Fir'aun, the likes of Nimrod, the likes of Qarun, the likes of certain nations, the Qawm of Ad and the Qawm of Lut and the Qawm of, for example, the she-camel of Saleh. You find that all of these different nations were destroyed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala highlights the akhlaq that they used to have as well. And I, living in the 21st century, have a responsibility to observe and to adhere towards all of the good akhlaq and then to refrain from all of the bad akhlaq. And therefore a question is raised, and it's a vital question. It gives rise to a very fundamental question. Say, okay, we find the ayah in the Holy Quran, وَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا, that history tends to repeat itself. You will not find a change in the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Fine, we agree with that. But does that mean that, for example, we have no free will? I, as a human being, for example, living in this world, when I do good, there are consequences. When I do bad, there are consequences. Not just consequences in my life, We need to understand this. Sometimes, people come forward and they have this mentality. They come forward and they say, well, this is my choice. This is my life. If I want to drink, for example, then let me drink. What is it with you? As in, you go mind your own business and I will mind my own business. If I want to, for example, steal, or if I engage in a trade or in a business that sells haram, sells alcohol, for example, in the shelves, then what is it with you? Let you do your own thing and let me do my thing. Islam comes forward and says, no, because you are a Muslim, because we live in a society, your actions has an impact in the people in society. Just because you do not care about the people around you doesn't mean that your actions will not affect them. If a person comes to the mosque, for example, and shows rude behavior, if a person comes to the mosque, for example, and does not adhere to the akhlaq of being in a mosque, does not, for example, abide by the sharia of the religion of Islam, then I will step forward and say that your behavior is unacceptable. Because my son who is here with me is observing your actions. And he may think that it's perfectly normal to behave in such a way. If I have, for example, a vision to raise my children in one way or the other, you have no right to intervene and to act, for example, mischievously in front of my son. Otherwise, I will take that as a responsibility upon myself to stop you where you are and to make sure that you do not behave in such ways in a place like a mosque. So you find people come forward and they say, well, if the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has been established, then it means that our good and our bad has no effect in history at all. As in, if history repeats itself, then what's the point of free will? If you observe it from this perspective, if you say, for example, that human beings have free will, then we collectively as a society are able to change history. If we all work together, for example, as one unified society, then we can change the outcomes of history, which is different to the history that has come before us. Then this would negate the ayah of the Holy Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that you will not find a change in the precedence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا. But if you come forward and say that no, the history of Allah constantly repeats itself because of the ayah of the Holy Quran, then this negates free will. Because whatever we do, history is bound to repeat itself. Whether all of us work together in goodness or all of us work together and not adhere to the Sharia of Islam, it has no effect in the books of history. It has no effect in the outcome because Allah has already determined that outcome. What's the answer between this particular misunderstanding? You find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers this in the Holy Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, He says that Sahih, there are trends in history, but at the same time you have to understand إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not change the condition of the people unless the people change what is in their hearts. Allah will not bring about change within a community unless the people take the first step towards that change. What does that mean? How is this verse used as an answer? The idea behind this, as examined by the scholars, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is explaining here that the human being has been created in a very systematic way. Within every single human being, there is a battle that takes place between us amongst ourselves. On the one hand, my desire pulls me on towards one direction. Then my aql pulls me towards the other direction. The human being, there is a battle that takes place between us. Our responsibilities, as long as we are alive, is to make sure that our aql guides us towards that which is true and that which is pure. If we paralyze the aql and we follow our desires, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, listen, you're not the first nation to follow your desires. There have been many that have come before you, and each and every single one of them have followed their desires, and look at their outcome. Only a few in history have followed their aql, and these few, they have been subjected to Allah's mercy and bounties. Allah has perfected them not only in dunya but in akhirah as well. But those who follow their desires, Allah has rebuked them, Allah has reprimanded them. And so therefore, when you go into ilm al-akhlaq, when you go to ilm al-irfan, for example, you find that majority of the scholars explain to us. They say that it is easy for a person to be subdued by his desires and not by his aql. It is natural for a person to be subdued by his desires, and many of our desires are sinful. Yes, many of our desires are sinful unless we project them towards that which is halal. But generally speaking, you find that it's easy to perform and to act out with regards to our desires. Many nations have fallen because they have not been able to rise above their desires. In the sense that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has empowered the human being himself to create change in the books of history, to create his own future. Whatever and whenever a nation pursues the right path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah makes the life of that person and the life of his nation prosperous. But unfortunately, you find that many nations that have come before us, they have not taken on board the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so therefore, they have not seen prosperity. The norms of history provide opportunities for man to show and to choose his own choice, has given man the freedom of choice. And so when you're aware of these laws, you can influence them. When we're aware of the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the choices that's there within our hands, we can influence them. Yes, otherwise we can keep our eyes shut and we can let, for example, our desires overpower us, and then we will see the same fate as those that have come before us. So you find that the idea of history repeating itself does not negate or go against the concept of history repeating itself. Yes, it does not contradict the idea that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the system whereby history repeats itself constantly over and over again. And so, coming to the second area of our discussion, you find that there are others, or there are those historians, there are those scholars. What they do is they examine the books of history. They examine historical evidences. They see, for example, that whenever or every time an event takes place, they understand and recognize that there are certain factors which are involved in that particular event, which then brings about a specific effect. When the historian or the scholar begins to examine these elements, he can then sit back and realize whether these elements were good or whether these elements were evil. Yes, all events, because of these elements, either brings about goodness or it brings about evil in the particular nation. Those who study the books of history are able to extract these elements and decide whether it's good for a community or not. So, for example, you take a nation that has gone through a severe war. Yes, war, unfortunately, has been there since the beginning of history. This is an example of how history tends to repeat itself. That two nations will always engage in war. In the past 100, 150 years, or even going back 200 years, you will not find a single nation that has not engaged in war with another country. Every single nation has always been at war with one nation or another in history. So you find that when you have a particular society or a community that has gone through war, after the war or the battle finishes, you have many casualties that follow because of that war. You find that the people tend to mourn, and the people will mourn in their own cultural different ways. And that particular incident will be remembered throughout the years. Now, question. So what do we do after this? Do we, for example, live our lives and move on, try and repopulate, or do we learn from it? So you find that there are those who learn from it. They try and extract information as to what caused the war, what happened, what strategies were used, why was it delayed, or why we lost, or whatever, why one party won and one party lost. All of these elements are realized and they are examined. Scholars will learn from it. They will, for example, dissect the whole incident inside out. They will change policies, they will create new policies, they will try and create a better system out of it. So that it can either prevent the war happening again, or that when it does happen again, they are more suited, they are more prepared for it. So you find, for example, in this area, you find that naturally what happens is that when war takes place, something as severe as war, people aren't just going to move on and mourn, yes, for the casualties that they faced. They are going to learn from it and make sure that it doesn't happen again. Likewise, Karbala, when you bring your minds towards Karbala, when you take your minds towards Karbala, you find that Karbala is an event in history that happened 1400 years ago, yet it changes the course of history. And it will change the course of history until the day of judgment. How? Because Karbala in itself is a powerful movement, so powerful that it has the ability to impose a regime. Yes, you look at, for example, the Bani Umayyah. The Bani Umayyah were uprooted because of Karbala. and many different, for example, oppressive regimes in this world, even today, you find that there are those who stand against them because of the motivation that they seek from Karbala. So you find that Karbala is a battle that takes place 1400 years ago, yet the values and the principles that it emanates is embraced by those who fight for justice and those who, for example, stand for equality and equity amongst the people in their lands. So, with regards to the first area as to how history tends to repeat itself, war. War is one of the areas in which history tends to repeat itself. Number two, you find the concept of contentment and greed. Unfortunately, you find, and when you examine history, you find that majority of mankind has always been subjected to their greed. Greed has always caused the downfall of the human being. Very few in this world are content with what they have. Very few are happy with the little that has been given to them. But you find greed has somehow, in one way or another, overpowered the heart of the human being. And this in itself has caused the downfall of that particular person. No, beyond this, greed has caused the downfall of certain regimes, of certain nations as well. The death of a society, which is very much real as the death of a person, is because of greed in many a times. Yes, the greed of the 1% that controls the economy, that suppresses and violates the rights of the 99%, you find that that community will never prosper. You find, for example, in the ayah of the Holy Quran in Surah Al-Furqan, Allah speaks about those who choose their own lusts and their own desires as their gods. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala highlights a very important point here, that there are many in history, many individuals, given the choice that they have in their hands, they will always choose their desires to be their gods. And so when you find, for example, a community that steps forward and understands that change needs to be made, you find that many a times these communities and these societies, or the policymakers or the lawmakers, they will be inspired to make changes based on very futile or very mundane elements. You find, for example, when the scholars speak about making policies within a particular country, within a particular nation, they are not able to make the right policies. They're not able to move forward and create change within that community because what they are examining is not something that holds any value. In which way? In the sense that people are very much consistent in choosing materialistic values above spiritual values. And this brings us to the other factor of how history tends to repeat itself. Not only is mankind subjected to his greed, subdued by his greed, but you find that many a times mankind is subdued by the love of materialism. Yes, a man who is engrossed in his daily needs, for example, is always under the influence of wanting material things. He can't see beyond his needs and his desires. He can't see beyond what's there in front of him. He can't rise above it. And so, when these policymakers, for example, make policies to try and change the social conducts of society, their minds are only focused on what is material in front of them. We'll come to this more in a moment. So you find, for example, because of man's materialistic views and at the same time their intellectual vacuum, these societies, they're not able to choose better ideals such that they are content with, such that they can learn from and try and create progression within society. You look at, for example, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salatu wassalam. The Imam complains to Kumail ibn Ziyad al-Nakhai. He says to Kumail, Ya Kumail, there's a very big serious issue in our communities. Kumail says to him, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, what is it? He says, Kumail, it is the fact that the people are not interested in religion. The people are not interested in the fact of gaining knowledge. The people, they're running after this world. They don't understand that there is a life beyond this world. They run after this world in the famous sentence, a very phenomenal, profound hadith of the Imam alayhi salam. He says, Ya Kumail, there are three types of people in society. Kumail says, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, who are these three people? He says, number one, there are those who teach, and there are those who learn. And then he says, The third are those who are the riffraff in society. Imagine, majority of us are in the riffraff of society. We neither learn about Islam nor do we teach Islam. We want to create a business. We want to become affluent. We want to become rich. We want to become independent. We want to become, for example, needless of anyone and anything in this world, and therefore we run after the wealth of this world. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam says that a priority of a person should be that he gains knowledge or he teaches knowledge. Knowledge is what should circumvent the life of this person. Unfortunately, you find that the downfall of many individuals and the downfall of communities as a whole, and beyond that societies in our day and age and those that have come before us, is that people have been focused in running after the world. When this person becomes a prisoner of his needs and his desires, then you find that he is not able to think beyond that. And his efforts just revolves around that which he sees materialistically. And unfortunately, you find that such an individual does not see any fruit in his efforts. Beyond this, you find that not only is man subjected to his greed and materialism, but you find that one trend that constantly is repeated in history is that people constantly follow their forefathers. That there is an intellectual vacuum that is inherited by every nation. That we naturally tend to follow our forefathers. When Rasulullah came to these people, the Quraysh of Mecca, and said to them, for example, accept the religion of Islam, subdue yourself to the religion of Islam, majority of them came forward and said, but this goes against the message of our fathers and our forefathers. You find that the prophets that came before Rasulullah, when they came to their people and presented the message of Tawheed and Adala and Nabuwa and Qiyamah, they turned around and they said that this goes against the message of our forefathers. Our forefathers, for example, is the barometer of what's truth and what's falsehood. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala challenges them. It says, will you follow your forefathers even though they were considered to be unintelligent, they were considered to be fools, and they had no guidance whatsoever? Will you follow your forefathers even though they guide you towards the fires of hell? This was a rhetorical challenge presented by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. From a psychological perspective, you find that the development of a state, the development of a society, development from a society from a political perspective prevents any advancement, is not able to move forward and make any progress because people are simply following their forefathers. You find that there are many countries in the world, for example today, they are hell-bent in following the footprints of their forefathers. The forefathers of the country, for example, the forefathers of a particular continent. They established this country, therefore we must follow their constitution. We must follow their law. Because, why? Because they were the founding fathers of our particular nation. You find that this is not a way to move forward. They lived in their time. They had certain issues and certain problems. They tried to find solutions to those problems. 200, 300 years later, we are facing different problems. The answers to our problems is not their answer to their problems. Yes, people need to move on. People need to move on from time as time progresses. So you find from that perspective, one of the downfalls of society which the Quran highlights is that people are constantly following the forefathers. People are constantly following the values of their fathers and their forefathers. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rejects this completely. That the idea of the religion of Islam is that a person should not blindly follow the footsteps of others. Even if it means denouncing, for example, that which is sacred, that which is holy. A person should always be able to think for himself. A person should always be able to ask questions. The religion of Islam is a religion that advocates the need of asking questions. Beyond this, so not only, for example, does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speak about the factors which cause the downfall of communities, and that is greed, and that is, for example, following the footprints of your forefathers, but you find that the idea of tyrants and tyranny, that also tends to repeat itself. again and again in history. In which way? You find that there are many nations that have come before us. Many nations that have come before us that have followed the footprints of oppression. Many leaders have come and they have overpowered their nation. They have, for example, oppressed their nation, projected their values on that nation for the sake of having power and might. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continuously reminds us of their aqibah, reminds us of their downfall. You look at the likes of Fir'aun, you look at the likes of Nimrod, you look at the likes of, for example, those who used to rule over their lands, those who used to slaughter the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Many of these nations that were destroyed by the adhab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah makes it a point. Allah highlights their downfall by explaining that look what they used to do. Yes, tyranny is never an answer. This pharaonic authority, which may appear as a strategy for that particular person, is not something that causes any advancement within society. It is something that causes a downfall in society. Yes, even today you find that there are tyrants in particular countries. Recently you had, for example, the likes of Saddam Hussein. You had the likes of Hitler. You had the likes of, for example, Mussolini. Many others that have come before us. This is not something new. It has existed from the very first days in history. A community and the downfall of a nation is because of tyrants and oppression. Not only that, but beyond this, not only is there oppression towards a particular nation, but there is the battle between haqq and batil as well. That constantly repeats itself in history. The battle between, for example, corruption and the battle between corruption and truth has always existed. From the very first days of Adam alayhi salam, you find the two sons of Adam, they represent it's a beautiful example of how haqq and batil is at battle with one another. It started from that time until this day and age. You find that in this day and age you have people who are killing one another because of their beliefs. One party belonging to haqq and the other party belonging to batil. When you therefore turn your minds towards Karbala and Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, it was a manifestation between haqq and batil. Not only that, but you find that the Imam alayhi salam, what's beautiful is that he does not follow the sunnah of his brother, Imam Hassan alayhi salam. Imam Hassan, when he was given the chance to sign a treaty with Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, Imam Hassan goes ahead and he signs the peace treaty. Whereas Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, he stands against Yazid. He refuses to sign a peace treaty. That's something beautiful. Imam Hassan fought against batil by signing a peace treaty, whereas Imam Hussein alayhi salam fought batil by giving his life and the life of his families. You find not only that, but beyond that, look at all of these different factors of how history tends to repeat itself. You find that not only is there the battle between haqq and batil, something that consistently and constantly repeats itself in history, but oppression that is vented. It is always vented towards those who represent the truth. And this is based on the ayah of the Holy Quran. أَمْ يَحْسَدُونَ النَّاسَ عَلَى مَا آتَاهُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains that there are certain groups of individuals in this world that they represent the truth, that they are pure. And we have given them fada'il, one after the other. But then you will always find that the nation, or there are people in their nation that constantly envy them. And because of this envy, they treat them with oppression. From the very first, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, he was seen as a man of knowledge. He was seen as a man of valor. He was seen as a man of, for example, bravery. There was a reputation to his name. Yes, you look at, for example, the words of Umar ibn al-Khattab. He comes forward and he says, "Lawla Ali, lahalak al-Umar." Very famous words. If it was not for Ali, then Umar would have perished. You find, for example, in terms of military power, military expeditions, establishing law and order, giving judgments constantly. Imam Ali alayhi salam was sought, advised from. Imam Ali was the first person that that Umar used to go towards. Yes, you go to the generations after, 6 generations later, the same words are mentioned again. By whom? Abu Hanifa. You find, for example, Abu Hanifa famously comes forward and he says, "Lawla sanatan lahalak al-Nu'man." Nu'man ibn Hanifa, Abu Hanifa, he comes forward and he realizes that the 2 years that I spent with Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, I would have never been the faqih that I have become. I would never be a scholar because of the 2 years that I spent with Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. Just as how Ali alayhi salam was profound in his knowledge, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam was also profound in his knowledge. But then, because of all of these fada'il, you found that the enemies would always envy them. And the enemies would always, for example, harm them in one way or another, to the extent that the history testifies that each and every single Imam of the Ahl al-Bayt were either poisoned or they were struck by the sword. When Sha'bi was asked, he says, "What do you say about Ali ibn Abi Talib?" Sha'bi replies, he says, "What can I say about a man? His followers hide his characteristics and his attributes out of fear that they will be killed. And his enemies hide his attributes and his characteristics because of the envy they have towards him." Yes, so you find that the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam, because of the fada'il that they have been given, they were mazloomeen, as we constantly remind ourselves. They were victims of oppression. Even today, the followers of the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam are victims of oppression. When you look towards, for example, Pakistan and India, when you look towards, for example, certain areas of the world in Iraq and Afghanistan, you find that the Shia Ithna Ashariya, the followers of the Ahl al-Bayt, are the victims of the oppression that is existing in those lands. It is because of the love of Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. So you find this is something not new. This is something that has existed in history. You read the times of Mutawakkil, you read the times of Mansur al-Dawani. You look at, for example, Marwan ibn Hakim, and how the Ahl al-Hakim, the family of Marwan, when they took over the Bani Umayyah, how they slaughtered the Shias. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi, how he used to slaughter the Shias. Yes, oppression was specific for the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam. When Shahristani, he speaks about the Shias in Milal wa Nahal, he says, "I, as a historian, have never come across an incident that has caused so much bloodshed because of the belief in Imamah. Believing in the Imamah automatically makes you a target." And this is something that history has testified, and it is something that has and constantly will be until the Day of Judgment, until the Imam reappears. You find, for example, one area or one factor which reminds us, Quranic factor, which reminds us how history tends to repeat itself, is how people tend to interact with the truth. What does this mean? It means that when the truth is given to the people, you will find a very small minority of the people accepting that truth, and the majority rejecting it altogether. When you look at the story of Talut, when Talut is appointed as a general of the army of the Bani Israel, they would come forward and they say that Talut is just a normal man. Why should we follow such a person? Hold on a second, Allah has commanded you to obey him. He says even then he is just a normal man. The story continues in Surah Al-Baqarah, explaining what? The story continues to explain that Talut, he commands his army that when you cross this particular land, you will come across a river. Do not drink from that river. You will be thirsty, but do not drink from that river. You find that the majority went and they drank from that river. Only the minority stood and obeyed his orders. They showed love towards Talut and they showed loyalty towards Talut. The minority. History repeats itself in the sense that the majority will leave the truth and the minority will always accept it. The minority in this day and age are home, according to the tafasir of the Ahl al-Bayt, the minority in the world who accept the truth are those who accept the message of the Ahl al-Bayt. And if you look at it from that perspective, you realize that the Shia Ithna Ashariya, we are low in number, yes, compared to the whole Muslim population. Even when you turn your minds towards Ashura, you find that the minority were with the haqq, whereas the majority were not with the haqq. Yes? How history beautifully repeated itself on the day of Ashura. They say not only that, but you find something profound on the 10th of Muharram, that even the children were willing to accept the truth and give their lives for the truth. The likes of Qasim, the son of Imam Hassan alayhi salatu wassalam. You find that Qasim was not the only child to accept the truth. You had Own and Muhammad, for example. But then you also had Abdullah, the son of Muslim ibn Aqil. Abdullah, what's his musibah? They say he goes into the battlefield and he approaches his enemies. There was a man from the camps of Umar ibn Sa'ad. He narrates, he says, I took out an arrow and I shot it towards the face of Abdullah. Abdullah, he saw the arrow coming towards him. What does he do? He doesn't move out the way. He puts his hand up to cover his face, to try and block his face from the arrow. The narrations say that the arrow pierces the palm of this child and it pierces the forehead, such that his hand is stuck now to his forehead. Then a man approaches him and strikes his heart with a spear. Then Qasim, when he passes away, the man who shot him with the arrow reapproaches his body. He says that I came to collect my arrow again. When I came towards his body, I saw that his hand was stuck on his forehead. And I tried to pull out the arrow. I wiggled it this way and that way. The arrow would not come off until I pulled it with such strength that the arrow now came off. But the wooden part of the arrow came off. The blade of the arrow remained on his forehead. These were children. This is how children were behaved and treated on the day of Ashura. And then you have, for example, the likes of Qasim. They say that on the 10th of Muharram, Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, many of his companions, all of his companions had been taken away from him. He stands on the plains of Karbala and he calls out for help. Says, Hal min nasirin yansuruna, Hal min mu'inin yu'inuna. He says, is there anyone to help me? Is there anyone to aid me? They say that Qasim comes running to Abu Abdullah alayhi salam. When he sees Qasim, Abu Abdullah begins to cry and he embraces Qasim. Qasim says to his Mawla, he says to his master, he says, Ya Amma, I don't have any energy in me. I cannot stay patient like this. He says, I don't have the patience anymore to not do anything. Abu Abdullah alayhi salam replies, he says, Ya Qasim, Anta wadi'a min akhi. He says, you are an amanat from my brother. Whenever I see you, you remind me of my brother Al-Hassan. He says, Qasim, why do you hasten towards your death? Qasim replies, he says, Ya Amma, you have remained amongst your enemies, and there is no helper amongst you, and there is no one to aid you. You have not found a helper, nor have you found a supporter. I am your helper, and I am your supporter. I am the one who will protect you. The Imam alayhi salam tells Qasim, he says, no, I do not give you the ijazah to go and give your life like this. He goes back to his mother. Qasim goes back to his mother. His mother says to him, what happened? Upon which Qasim says, he will not let me go. His mother says, hold on Qasim, there is a letter that has been given by your father Al-Hassan. When Qasim reads the letter, he goes running back to Abu Abdullah. He gives Abu Abdullah alayhi salam the letter. The Imam opens the letter. It's from the writings of his brother Al-Hassan. What does the letter say? The letter says, Ya bunayya idha wajadta ammaka madhluman wa atshanan wa ghariba. It says, my son, if you find your uncle oppressed in the lands of Karbala, thirsty in the lands of Karbala, and a stranger, Then go and help him and give your life for Abu Abdullah. The Imam cries and he weeps. Then he calls out, Ya Rabbab, Ya Ramla, Ya Zainab, Ya Sukaina, come and bid farewell to Qasim, for he will not return. The Imam alayhi salam dresses him in such a way that Qasim enters the battlefield wearing his kafan. Qasim now enters the battlefield. Habib ibn, the narrations tell us, Habib ibn Muslim tells us, he says that when Qasim enters the battlefield, when he enters the sands of Karbala, the battlefield, it was as if a full moon was bright shining in front of us. Then he calls out these battle cries. He says, In tunkiruni fa'ana ibn al-Hasan. If you do not know who I am, let me tell you who I am. I am Qasim, the son of Hassan, Sibt al-Nabi al-Mustafa al-Mu'taman, the son of Rasulullah, the grandson of Rasulullah. هذا الحسين كالأسير المرتهن. He says, this is Hussein, and you've taken him as a captive. بين أناس, amongst the people, لا سقوا صوب المزن. May the rahmah of Allah be cut off from you. May the la'na of Allah be on you. They say that Qasim begins to fight, and he fights bravely. He fights like a warrior, just as how his father was in the state of battle. They say there was a man by the name of Amr ibn Sa'ad, not Umar ibn Sa'ad, Amr ibn Sa'ad. He says that Wallah, I will approach this boy and strike him on his head. Amr ibn Sa'ad then approaches Qasim, and he strikes with his sword on the head of Qasim. When he strikes him, the narrations tell us, ضرب رأسه بالسيف ففلقه, and he struck him on the head of Qasim in such a way that his head split open. ووقع الغلام إلى الأرض لوجهه, and Qasim then fell on the ground on his face. And when he fell on the ground on his face, ونادى, and he called out, he screamed, Ya Amma, Adrikni, Adrikni, oh my uncle, come help me, come help me. Imam alayhi salam then rushes and hastens towards Qasim. They say that when the Imam alayhi salam approaches Qasim, that man was still there, Amr ibn Sa'ad. What does the Imam do? The Imam approaches Amr ibn Sa'ad and strikes him with his sword, and Amr ibn Sa'ad, his hand is severed from his body. Amr ibn Sa'ad then he calls out to the Kufans and he tells them, oh men, come help me, help me. They rush towards Amr ibn Sa'ad. Now imagine the scene, all of these horse riders were coming towards Qasim, they were coming towards Abu Abdullah, they were coming towards Amr ibn Sa'ad. When Abu Abdullah alayhi salam saw that the men are coming towards him, he moves aside, and they came, and the body of Qasim was trapped under the hooves of the horses. They began trampling on the body of Qasim, they began kicking his body this way and that way, shredding the holy body into pieces. They say that when they went back to their camps, Abu Abdullah alayhi salam came towards the head of Qasim, and he saw Qasim was moving. He was frantically kicking his legs up and down from side to side because of the pain that Qasim was going through. وحسينا وعليا. Abu Abdullah then takes off his abba and he begins to collect the pieces of Qasim and he places it in the abba. Then Hamid ibn Muslim narrates, he says, ثم حمله ووضع صدره على صدره. He says, and he carried Qasim. How did he carry Qasim? He placed the chest of Qasim on the chest, on his own chest, and kind of held him in this way and took him back towards the camps of the women. And he says that when we saw Abu Abdullah alayhi salam carry Qasim on his chest, the feet of Qasim will be dragged on the sands of Karbala. As in, imagine how much his body had been stretched by the trampling of the horses that Abu Abdullah, whilst carrying him, his body, his legs were being dragged on the sands. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. سورة المباركة الفاتحة.